bottle flashes up and stops an inch from his throat. Glass edge jagged, wet with blood that is not his. Her head bleeds where someone split her, hair matted, eyes feral and bright. He holds a skinning knife low, not raised, breath tight. She spits and says, "Don't touch me." He says, "I'm not touching you." She says, "You moved." He says, "You swung." She says, "I warned you." The chair scrapes as she backs up, heel catching, bottle shaking in her fist. He says, "Put it down." She says, "Make me." He says, "You'll cut yourself." She laughs, short and broken, says, "Already did." Blood dots the floor like dropped seeds. He steps aside, slow. She tracks him, arm high. He says, "You can sit." She says, "I don't sit." He says, "Then stand." She says, "You think you own me now." He says, "No." She says, "Men always say no first." He says, "I'm not those men." She says, "You all say that." The house holds its breath. Old boards creak as if listening. He smells iron and sap and smoke in her hair. He says, "You're bleeding bad." She says, "It'll stop." He says, "It won't." She says, "Don't touch me again." He says, "I hear you." She says, "Do you?" He nods once. She doesn't lower the bottle. She lunges without warning. The bottle skids off his knife, glass biting his knuckle. He swears. She screams like she's falling. He grabs her wrist, then lets go, palms up, knife dropping to the table. He says, "Stop." She keeps screaming, sound ripping her raw. He backs away. She slides down the wall, bottle clattering, knees folding. She tries to stand and fails. He says, "Breathe." She says, "Don't tell me that." He says, "Slow then." She says, "I can't." He says, "Look at me." She says, "I won't." He sits on the stool, hands on his thighs, eyes low. He says, "Nobody's coming." She laughs again, thin. She says, "They always come." He says, "Not here." She says, "You don't know that." He says, "I do." She wipes her face with her sleeve, smearing blood. He says, "You want water." She says, "Poison." He says, "From the well." She says, "That's worse." He stands, fills a tin cup anyway, sets it down, steps back. She watches the cup like it might move. He says, "Drink when you want." She doesn't. Minutes pass or seconds. The clock ticks loud. She asks what you do with bodies. He says, "What?" She says, "When they don't breathe anymore." He says, "I don't do that." She says, "Everyone does something." He says, "I cut trees." She says, "Trees don't scream." He says, "Some do." She almost smiles, then doesn't. She asks why you didn't hit me. He says, "Because you were already hurt." She says, "They all say that too." He says, "I didn't." She says, "You're saying it now." He says, "I'm done saying things." Silence thickens. Outside, something moves, engine or wind, and she flinches hard. He says, "It's nothing." She says, "Everything is something." He nods. He looks at the door, the locks, the blood drying. He says, "You're safer here." She says, "Nowhere is safe." He says, "Safer than the road." She says, "For now." She sways. He moves the chair with his foot. She drops into it like strings cut, shaking hard. He takes off his coat, pauses, asks, "Can I?" She nods once, eyes never leaving him. He drapes it over her shoulders without touching skin. She grips it tight. He says, "You can stay." She jerks up. He says, "Just tonight." She stares, chest hitching, then slumps, breath slowing, eyes still locked on him, unblinking. She wakes with her cheek stuck to the table, dried blood pulling at her skin. His coat hangs heavy on her shoulders, smelling of wood and old smoke. She jerks upright, scanning the room. He's at the stove. He hears her move and says morning without turning. She says, "Don't call it that." He says, "You slept." She says, "I passed out." He sets a bowl down between them, steam rising. She says I'm not hungry. He says eat anyway. She says I don't trust food I didn't watch get made. He says then watch. He sits. He doesn't touch his own bowl. She studies the walls, the corners, the ceiling beams. She says this place is loud. He says it's old. She says old places remember. He says they also keep quiet. She says that's worse. He shrugs. She asks how long you've been alone. He says long enough. She asks why take me in. He says you were bleeding. She says lots of folks bleed. He says not on my floor. She snorts. She says they say I'm too wild. He says who? She says everyone. He says that's not an answer. She says the women. The men. The ones with keys. He says keys to what? She says doors that don't open. He pushes the bowl closer. She doesn't eat. She says they say I can't be kept. He says you're not livestock. She says they tried anyway. He says who? She says you're asking a lot of questions for a house that doesn't. He goes still. She watches his hands. She says they say I burned 3 homes. He says did you? She says I watched them burn. He says that's not the same. She says it is when you get blamed. He says fire tells the truth. She laughs once. She says fire lies too. He says eat. She shakes her head. She listens again, ear tilting. He says what are you hearing? She says footsteps that aren't here yet. He says you're safe. She says don't say that word. He says fine. He says you're inside. She says walls don't stop men. He says they stop me. She looks at him then, really looks. She says you don't look like you stop easy. He says I do when I choose. She says why choose now? He says because you asked me not to touch you and I listened. She goes quiet at that. She finally lifts the spoon, takes a small bite, winces like it might bite back. He says slow. She says don't coach me. He says sorry. She eats 2 more bites. She says they call me a problem. He says problems get fixed. She says they call me a curse. He says curses are stories. She says stories get people killed. He says not all. She says enough. A sound hits the door. Not loud. Firm. She freezes mid-breath. He stands without thinking. She whispers don't. He says stay. She slides off the chair, moving low, fast, coat slipping. She hisses where? He nods to the back, the dark hall. She says he knows me. He says who? She says him. The knock comes again, harder, patient. Official. He steps to the door. Her hand catches his wrist. She shakes her head, eyes wide, wet. He stills. The knock comes again. His hand hovers over the latch and freezes there as the knock comes again. He opens it just enough to see the smile. The sheriff fills the frame like he owns it, hat tipped back, badge clean, eyes calm. He says morning. The lumberjack says what do you want? The sheriff says friendly way to start. He says you knocked. The sheriff says twice. He says I heard. The sheriff looks past him, into the house. He says smells like blood. The lumberjack says cut my hand. The sheriff says careless. The lumberjack says happens. The sheriff steps closer without being invited. He says folks saw a girl run this way. The lumberjack says folks see lots of things. The sheriff smiles wider. He says this one's trouble. The lumberjack says aren't we all? The sheriff laughs softly. He says she's too wild. He says can't be kept. He says burned 3 homes. The lumberjack says sounds like talk. The sheriff says talk gets written down. He taps a ledger under his arm. The lumberjack says you write everything. The sheriff says only what matters. Behind the wall, the girl presses her mouth shut, breath shaking. She whispers he knows me. The lumberjack doesn't turn. He says you alone. The sheriff says never am. He glances down the road where a truck idles, engine low. He says governor's people don't like loose ends. The lumberjack says I don't have any. The sheriff says everyone does. He lifts the ledger a little. He says names, dates, habits. He says fire patterns. He says women who don't listen. The lumberjack shifts his weight. He says you accusing me. The sheriff says not yet. He says just checking. He says old families like things quiet. He says you're a quiet man. The lumberjack says I cut trees. The sheriff says trees fall loud. He chuckles at his own joke. No one joins him. The sheriff leans in, lowering his voice. He says house like this holds echoes. He says boards remember boots. He says walls sweat fear. The lumberjack says you're done. The sheriff says almost. He looks at the floor, the faint dark spots, the scuff where the chair moved. His eyes drift toward the floorboards by the hall. He says you got someone back there. The girl's hand shakes against her mouth. The lumberjack doesn't answer. The house doesn't either. The sheriff waits, patient as rot. He says you always been helpful. The lumberjack says you always been nosy. The sheriff nods. He says part of the badge. He taps it once. He says law needs eyes everywhere. The lumberjack says law should knock once. The sheriff smiles again. He says I did. Silence stretches thin. A bird calls and stops. The sheriff straightens. He says if you see her. He says bring her in. He says town will be safer. The lumberjack says safer for who? The sheriff says everyone who behaves. He steps back. He says appreciate your time. He tips his hat. He says we'll talk again. The lumberjack says maybe. The sheriff says soon. He turns, boots thudding down the steps. The truck door opens, closes. The engine fades. The lumberjack shuts the door slow, locks it, rests his head against the wood for a beat. From the hall, she whispers is he gone? He says yes. She steps out, eyes still wide. She says he knows my walk. He says he knows paper. She says paper kills. He doesn't answer. She sinks onto the floor, back to the wall. She says they write lies and call it order. He says they call it peace. She says peace never held me. He looks at the badge mark the sheriff left on the air. He says you can stay hidden. She says hiding makes it worse. He says it keeps you breathing. She says breathing isn't living. He says it's a start. Outside, footsteps crunch again, slower, circling. Ash from the stove drifts as the steps return, measured, listening. The sheriff is gone, but the house feels smaller, heavier. She stands by the stove, tossing letters one by one into the flames, watching them curl and blacken. He leans against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. She says they call me crazy. He says what did you do? She says they don't believe me. He says what do you mean? She says punishments meant to break me, men who smiled when I flinched, whispers in empty rooms. He says I see you now. She says no one else ever did. Her hands shake over the fire. He says it's warm. She says it's not warmth, it's memory. She names men, voices clipped and sharp. First the one who ran the mill, then the one with land by the creek, then the one who always had a belt in his hands. He listens, nodding, recognizing the names like scars he's seen before. He says those are names you don't forget. She says names haunt, not ghosts. He says maybe both. She tosses another letter into the fire, sparks climbing the chimney like desperate eyes. She says letters lie, stories bend, people die. He says fire tells the truth. She laughs, short, bitter. She says fire lies too. He moves closer, careful, voice low. He says they said you were too wild. She says wild just means I didn't stay quiet. He says they'll still come. She says let them. She kicks a charred letter. Sparks fly. He says you could get hurt. She says worse already happened. She paces the room, barefoot, blood streaked on her arms from where a cut reopened. He says the coat's wet. She says it's nothing. He says nothing still bleeds. She stops, looking at him, eyes dark. She says, do you understand what that means? He says, I understand enough. The walls press in, shadows shifting. She points at the corner. She says they watched me there. He says who? She says everyone. The silence is thick. He says walls don't breathe. She says they do when people do wrong. She steps to the window, wipes soot from the sill. She says the letters told them I belonged outside. He says you belong inside. She says inside never wanted me. He says now it does. She tilts her head. She says fire burns people too. He says not here. She crouches near the flames again. She says I watched 3 homes burn. He says you survived. She says barely. He says that counts. She looks up at him. She says survival isn't the same as life. He says maybe it can be. She moves to the table, dragging the chair closer to the fire. She says life didn't want me before. He says life didn't ask. She says it did, in the dark, in the screams, in the men who smiled when I cried. He says those smiles are gone now. She throws another letter, sparks crackle, smoke curls. She says they never go. Footsteps scrape outside, careful, measured. She freezes, eyes on the window. He says don't move. She says it's them. He whispers maybe not. She waits, shoulder tense. A branch knocks against the siding, light shifting. She exhales, soft, then a shuddering laugh escapes. He says what is it? She says everything at once. She says the letters, the walls, the fire, the men. She says all of it. He says you'll burn them away. She shakes her head. She says some things can't burn. She bends closer to the fire. She whispers names under her breath. He says loud enough to hear. She says no, loud enough to remember. Her tears fall unnoticed, steam from the flames hiding them. He moves a hand toward her, then stops. He says I won't touch you. She nods. The fire reflects in her eyes. She says wild means saying yes when they wanted silence, saying no when they said yes. She laughs again, dry, sharp. She says wild just means I didn't stay quiet. The floorboards groan with footsteps. Her head snaps up. He says someone's outside. She stares at him, firelight catching the wet streaks on her face. She whispers, do they follow letters? He says some things follow. She says they follow people too. He nods once. She turns back to the stove, tossing the last letter in. Sparks rise. Smoke curls. Ash floats upward. Footsteps stop outside, then continue, lighter this time. She listens. He watches the door, hand on the latch, waiting, silent. They move in whispers, crouched low behind the stacked firewood, the floorboards creaking under careful steps. She's tense, eyes flicking toward every shadow. She says I should run. He says you won't get far. She says I could. He says not tonight. She bites her lip, nods once. Her hands clench into fists. She says they'll find me. He says only if you let them. She glances toward the hall. He says stay low. She breathes hard, chest hitching. He says slow it. She says can't. He whispers, then, just breathe. She talks about the well behind the old mill, voice trembling. She says screams never stop there. She says they echo in stone, water, shadows. He says echoes fade. She says not the ones in your head. She leans back against the wall. He watches, sees the sharp edge of fear, the raw weight she carries. He says I know loss. She looks at him. He says my sister vanished long ago. She swallows, shakes her head. She whispers, what was her name? He can't answer. Silence stretches heavy between them, pressing down like dust. Her tears start slow, dampening her hair. She says I've been running for years. He says then stop. She laughs, short, broken. She says stop where? He says here. She curls her hands into her coat, pressing it to her chest. He sits beside her, careful not to touch. She whispers about the men, about the landowners, about the ones who smiled while they punished. He listens. She says the well swallowed everything. She says screams, hope, time. She says even me. He doesn't speak. He only lets her speak. She begins to cry softly, quiet at first, shoulders shaking. He says it's all right. She says no, it isn't. Her sobs rise, faster, harder, until they shake the floorboards beneath her. He leans forward, voice low. He says tell me. She says names, times, the ones who thought silence could own me. He says you survived. She says barely. She wipes her eyes on her sleeve. She says running doesn't help when they wait. He says then stand with me. She says I can't. He says maybe not yet. They argue in hushed tones about the future. She says you'll hand me in. He says I won't. She says I can't stay. He says no one's making you. She says then I go alone. He says if you leave, they'll find you. She bites her lip, silent. The well behind the mill looms in her mind, dark, cold. She says the screams never stop. He says you'll carry them, but you'll survive. She nods slightly, trembling. He admits more about his sister, the unanswered questions, the grief lodged in the empty halls of his past. She listens, silent for a moment. She says my name, whispered through tears. He looks at her, startled, voice breaking. She repeats it, shaking, and he realizes the truth. She survived what others did not. Ash from the fireplace drifts lazily into the air between them. She says what was her name. He can't answer. She curls against herself, shaking. He says I'm sorry. She says sorry doesn't help. They sit, both lost in memory and fear, a house full of shadows watching. She presses her palms to the floor, whispering, trying to find balance. He leans back, hands braced against the wood. He says maybe it's time to stop hiding. She says hiding doesn't save anyone. He says maybe not. She closes her eyes, letting tears fall, soft at first, then heavier, louder. He remains, silent, letting her grief echo in the house. Shadows shift as the flames in the stove crackle and rise. Her tears fall into the silence, her body trembling, lungs burning, until finally the sobs subside into quiet, broken breaths, leaving them both staring at the fire, the walls, and the memories that will not let go. The firelight dances across her tear-streaked face, and she rocks back on her heels, trembling. Her voice is barely a whisper at first, shaky and small, but it carries. She says it slowly, each syllable breaking through years of fear. He freezes, chest tight, hearing the name he thought lost forever. His eyes widen. He says what? She repeats it, louder this time, voice cracking, echoing off the walls like a confession that had been buried too long. He steps closer, unsteady, hand hovering in the air, not daring to touch. He says it can't be. She says it is. Breath comes hard and ragged, words tumbling over each other. She says I'm here. He whispers, they buried you. She wipes her face, fingers trembling over her mouth. She says they tried. Her knees fold under her, coat slipping to the floor, damp with sweat and old blood. He kneels opposite, watching, listening. The room holds its breath. She says every night I thought I'd be gone, that they would win. He says they didn't. She says I was broken, they left me broken. He says you're not broken now. She laughs, short, humorless. She says it doesn't feel like it. He says feelings lie. She says they scream anyway. She looks at him, voice barely audible. She says, do you understand what it took? He says, I think I do. She says, maybe not. He says, maybe enough. Her hands tremble in her lap. She repeats the name again, almost pleading with the walls to recognize it, to recognize her. He says, you survived everything. Her tears come harder, falling freely now, soaking the floor and her hair. She says, I thought I'd never be seen. He says, I see you. She says, seen doesn't mean safe. He says, I can't undo the past, but I can keep you here. She shakes her head. She says it won't be enough. He says it's the start. She looks into his eyes, searching, desperate. She whispers, I'm the one you lost. He swallows hard, voice thick, says you're the same name. She nods, breath hitching. She says I was gone. He says I know. She says they said you'd never find me. He says I did. She rocks slightly, voice breaking, repeating the name once more, steadying herself with each syllable. He crouches lower, voice soft. He says I can't believe it. She says believe it. He says I hear it. She says it's all I have left. The fire reflects in her eyes, wide, haunted, alive. She says I survived the well, the men, the night, the silence. He says then you survived everything else. Her body trembles, small shivers through her shoulders. She whispers, they buried me. He says they tried. She pauses, chin quivering, and then she says again, slowly, almost daring him to disbelieve, I am here. The room is quiet except for their breathing, uneven, raw. He says I'll keep you. She says you can't keep me. He says maybe not. She says they'll follow me. He says not here. She curls in on herself, staring at the floor. She says what now? He says now we begin. She looks up, face wet with tears, voice softer but steady. She repeats her name again, eyes shining. He whispers, they buried you. She says they tried. She wipes her face roughly with the back of her hand, settling back against the wall, coat half off, chest rising and falling hard. He leans against the floorboards, silent, letting the weight of the moment hold them both. Outside, the wind moves through the empty yard, but inside, her name fills the house, solid, undeniable, alive, and for the first time in years, she breathes, not running, not hiding, but existing. The night is thick, smoke curling into the black sky. She stands at the edge of the millyard, coat clutched tight, eyes sharp and wild. He follows, careful, boots crunching on the gravel. She says we start now. He says it's dangerous. She says I've been living in danger for years. He says you could get caught. She says then I burn it down. Sparks fly from the torches they carry, wind pulling at flames that gutter in the dark. She sets one to the edge of the old boards. He says wait. She says too late. The fire catches, snapping, climbing, licking the dry wood. Smoke stings their eyes. He coughs. She doesn't flinch. Voices rise from the shadows of the trees, whispers of the past, men calling her name, threats long forgotten, echoes of cruelty. She steps forward, shouting names, accusing, claiming what they stole. He watches, alert, ready, but silent. The sheriff arrives late, boots heavy, eyes wide, hat shadowed. He says what the hell? She says too late for questions. Flames twist, throwing light across faces in the crowd. Men who thought power still theirs freeze, shadows leaping like ghosts on their faces. She says everyone sees now. He says careful. She says let them see. The fire roars, boards collapsing inward, sparks spraying into the air. She steps closer, voice higher, naming the governor's family, naming who let the cruelty happen, speaking truths no ledger recorded. He says it's enough. She says no. She moves among them, fearless, shouting the crimes, the lies, the silence. Voices in the dark answer her, murmurs, protests, denial. She says it won't work. He says stand back. She says I'm standing in truth. Flames curl higher, smoke thickening, acrid, stinging eyes and throats. She breathes it in, letting it fill her, let it burn away old fears. He says they'll come for us. She says let them. The sheriff steps closer, hat low, eyes wary. He says put it out. She laughs, short, sharp. She says the truth doesn't put out. He says you're crazy. She says maybe. He throws another name into the night, words cutting, sharp, heavy. The crowd murmurs, some shocked, some silent. Flames roar, the old mill collapsing in pieces, fire consuming walls, windows, the ledger, the smoke swallowing the night. He says stop before someone dies. She says let them see it. Let them feel it. Let them remember. Sparks dance across their skin. She steps forward, fire reflecting in her eyes. She says you hid me. You buried me. You lied about me. They hear it now. The sheriff moves closer, voice clipped. He says we'll take this down. She says too late. The lumberjack steps behind her, hands on her shoulders. He says you'll get hurt. She says it's not me anymore. The crowd watches in silence, awe and fear. She says the names aloud, voices sharp, accusing, final. She says this is what you deserve, seeing truth through smoke and flame. The fire crackles, consuming old boards, shadows stretching across the ground, reaching faces that never understood. She turns, voice low but certain. She says the governor's family. The name echoes. No one moves, no one speaks. Firelight flickers over stunned faces. Ash drifts like ghosts in the air. She drops the torch, letting the fire eat itself. Smoke swirls, heat pressing against skin, bodies frozen, eyes wide. The sheriff steps back, muttering under his breath. She says it again, louder this time, letting the words settle in the dark. He watches her, chest tight, breathing uneven, hands still on her shoulder. The fire roars behind them, but she stands taller than the flames, commanding the night. He says it's done. She says no, it's just begun. Silence follows. The fire crackles. Faces stare, the crowd holding its breath. Names hang in the air, heavy and final. Smoke curls, ash floats, and for the first time in years, the truth is seen. The house, the mill, the town, all of it feels the heat of reckoning, and the crowd cannot look away. Dawn comes heavy, orange and gray, smoke lingering over the burnt mill. She stands at the edge of the yard, arms folded, hair tangled and streaked with ash. The lumberjack stays behind her, watching, silent. She says they'll come for us. He says let them. She scans the scattered crowd of onlookers, some staring, some whispering, none moving. She steps forward, voice low, deliberate. She says the law hides behind badges and doors. He says it can't hide from you anymore. She laughs, short, bitter. She says it never did. The sheriff appears, haggard, boots heavy, eyes wary. He says this isn't how it's supposed to go. She says it's exactly how it goes. He opens his mouth, she cuts him off. She says enough words, enough lies, enough silence. He says you'll burn more than buildings. She says I burn truth, not homes. The lumberjack says stay back. She says they need to see. He doesn't argue. He watches her take control, standing tall, breathing heavy, eyes scanning faces. She steps closer to the sheriff, voice sharp. She says the systems protect themselves, don't they? He nods, stiff. She says now I speak. She names men, women, families who hid behind laws, paper, and fear. She says they never listened. She says they still don't. Her hands shake, but her voice is steady. She says I won't disappear again. He watches, careful, letting her own words lead the weight of the moment. She steps toward the house, toward the pile of ashes, and picks up the badge the sheriff dropped in the chaos. She turns it in her hands, spinning it slowly. She says this never belonged to you. The sheriff steps forward. He says give it back. She says no. She says the badge didn't protect anyone. It didn't save me. She says you hid behind it while people burned. He swallows, silent. He says we need order. She says order never saved anyone who mattered. The crowd murmurs, faces shifting. She lets the badge rest on the table, light glinting off its worn surface. She says it's a witness now. Not law, not men, not fear. She looks at the lumberjack. She says we survived. He says yes. She says no more running. He nods. Outside, the wind carries smoke into the yards, black and curling, like a warning. She breathes it in, shuddering, letting herself feel the weight, letting the fire mark its claim on the land and on them. He steps back, giving her space. She lifts her head, chest heavy with adrenaline and exhaustion. She says listen. Everyone should listen now. She repeats names, events, truths too long ignored. The crowd doesn't move. They can't look away. He says the world is still breathing, even after all this. She says it is. She says it's ours to claim. She turns, looking toward the burnt boards, the blackened earth. She says we survived it all, every whisper, every door, every shadow. He says the same people who hid behind laws will try again. She says let them. She says I'm not hiding, and I won't vanish. She steps forward, the badge still on the table, the ashes drifting. He watches her, silent, proud, wary. She breathes, steady now. The morning presses in, cold and quiet, but she stands, alive, seen, unbroken. No one reaches for the badge. The fire that took the mill, the truth she spoke, the courage she claimed, all that remains, and it breathes. The house is quiet, but not empty. Sunlight filters weakly through the soot-streaked windows, dust floating in the air like tiny ghosts. She stands where she once hid, coat draped loosely, hair tangled, face streaked with ash and tears. Her hands rest on the table, fingers brushing the badge, lingering over the weight of it. He leans against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her carefully. She says it feels different now. He says, what do you mean? She says I don't have to disappear. He says good. She says names matter. He nods, quiet. She looks at him, voice soft. She says mine matters most. She moves to the hearth, ashes swirling in the weak sunlight. She kneels, lifting her hand through them. She says fire shows you what's left. He says and what's left is stronger. She whispers the name again, clear and steady, letting it fill the room. He steps closer, voice low. He says no one can take it from you. She says they tried. He says they failed. She closes her eyes, letting the words settle, the memory of running, hiding, and screaming finally quiet. She says I am not afraid anymore. He says I see that. The walls seem to exhale. The house remembers differently now, not fear but endurance. She steps to the window, looking outside, sun warm on her face. She says it's strange. He says what? She says to be here, to breathe, to name myself. He says it's earned. She says earned through blood and ash. He nods. Silence stretches between them, comfortable, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. She says the world outside will still try to bury people. He says then let them try. She says they won't bury me again. She walks the floor slowly, touching the doorframes, the rough boards of the floor, the edges of the table. She says these walls won't whisper lies anymore. He says no. She says I will remember everything. He says and speak it. She says I will. She kneels again by the stove, still warm but quiet, and smiles faintly. She says standing here, saying my name, it doesn't feel like survival anymore. It feels like home. He watches her, expression softening. He says maybe it can be. She says it will be. The sun climbs higher. Dust drifts through the windows, touching her hair, catching in her lashes. She says names hold power, even mine. He says yours holds more than anyone knows. She turns to him, eyes steady, voice calm. She says thank you. He says for what? She says for seeing me, for letting me stay, for letting me speak. He says you did all the work. She says maybe, but without you, no one would have heard. He nods. She smiles faintly again, more certain now. She says I am here. She says my name. She says it aloud, fully, finally. The house listens. Sunlight falls on the badge on the table, on the ashes in the hearth, on the scars and shadows she carries. She says the fire took what needed to go. He says and left what matters. She walks toward the door, stopping to look back once. She says the past can try to follow, but it won't. She says my name stayed. He says yes. She opens the door slowly, stepping into the light, letting it wash over her, strong and steady. She breathes in deep, the world heavy and quiet, but hers now. She says I am here. She says my name again. And the house finally exhales, listening, remembering, and letting go. The air is still heavy with smoke and ash, sunlight cutting through the haze and catching on the jagged remnants of the mill beyond the yard. She steps out onto the porch, boots crunching on blackened gravel, coat hanging loose over her shoulders. The lumberjack follows, silent, keeping a careful distance. She says it feels different now, quieter but alive. He says it's what happens after fire. She looks at him, eyes wide, searching. She says I don't know what comes next. He says we find out. She swallows, breath-catching, and nods. The town beyond the yard is stirring, cautious, watching the aftermath. Windows peek open, doors cracked. She says everyone's watching. He says let them. She squints toward the horizon. She says they'll whisper names. He says they always do. She says but now they'll hear mine too. He nods once. She moves to the fence, running fingers along the splintered wood. She says it doesn't feel like fear anymore. He says then you've won a little. She laughs, small, sharp. She says a little isn't much. He says it's enough to start. She steps back from the fence, hands flexing, fists unclenching, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Inside, the house waits, walls still and watching. She walks to the table, eyes falling on the badge, ash, and scattered letters. She says this will stay here. He says it will. She lifts a charred piece, feeling the heat that lingers, and whispers the names of those who tried to bury her. He says let them lie in ashes. She nods, letting the smoke drift into memory. She says the past tried to shape me, to erase me, but it failed. He says it did. She leans against the table, eyes catching the morning light, voice low. She says I am not who they think I am anymore. He steps closer, voice soft, cautious. He says you're not alone anymore. She says maybe not. She breathes, letting herself feel it. The house exhales with her, quiet settling in the corners, filling the empty spaces with something steadier. She moves toward the hearth, ashes swirling, flickers catching in her eyes. She says I can remember everything without flinching. He says good. She smiles faintly, small and certain. She says that's power. He says it's more than power, it's proof. She kneels by the ashes, fingers tracing shapes in soot, and says fire teaches truth, but remembering makes it yours. Outside, the world hums softly, sun climbing, wind moving through broken boards and scorched fields. She walks to the edge of the yard, feeling each step on ash and gravel, voice low. She says I survived, I stood, I named myself. He watches, silent, steady, letting her claim the morning. She turns to him, eyes bright, voice firm. She says now the land listens. He says yes. She says I am here. She says my name aloud again, full, unbroken, unafraid. He nods, satisfied, letting the words settle in the quiet house and scorched earth around them. She takes a deep breath, chest rising and falling steady. He says what now? She says what comes next. She looks at the badge, the ashes, the house behind her, and finally at him. She says we stay, we remember, we speak. He says yes. She smiles faintly, turning her face to the sunlight, eyes bright, steady, unafraid. She says I am here. She says my name one last time for herself, for the house, for the land. And for the first time in years, the world feels like it belongs to her, if only a little. The wind moves through the yard, light glinting off ash and broken wood, carrying the weight of all that was lost and all that she survived. She breathes in, unbroken. He watches, quiet, letting her claim it. And in that moment, the house, the land, the air itself, seems to listen, waiting, remembering, and finally letting go. The sun falls low, painting the house in golden shadow, the air thick with the smell of smoke and ash that still lingers from the mill. She moves through the room slowly, hands brushing walls that have held her fear and grief for years. He follows a step behind, silent, careful not to break the fragile calm she carries. She says it's strange, this quiet. He says the quiet tells the truth. She nods once, slow, eyes tracing the edges of floorboards and doorframes, remembering every echo. She whispers her name aloud, soft, deliberate, letting it fill the empty spaces, and the house listens. She kneels at the hearth, ashes cold now, tracing shapes with fingers, remembering fire and names, the moments of rage and courage that brought her here. He sits on the edge of the table, voice low. He says you've carried it all for too long. She says maybe I had to. He says maybe now it's enough. She breathes, letting the air fill her lungs fully for the first time in years. She says I can finally say who I am without fear. He nods, eyes soft, voice careful. He says and no one can take it from you. She says no one. The past whispers faintly through the cracks in the walls, but it can't reach her anymore. She moves to the window, sunlight catching her hair, eyes bright and steady. She says it's strange to feel like this, to be seen, to stand in the middle of all that survived and say my name aloud. He says the name matters. She says it does. She steps back, looking at the badge on the table, ash swirling around it. She says this held witnesses, but the truth was always mine. He says you don't need proof anymore. She nods. She says the fire took what had to go. The house exhales around them, the walls holding memory without judgment. She whispers her name again, this time firm, clear, unbroken. He watches, letting it settle into the air between them. The wind moves through broken shutters, rustling leaves outside, carrying the scent of smoke and wood. She says I'm done hiding. He says you don't have to hide. She steps to the porch, boots crunching on the gravel, shoulders squared. She says the land listens now. He says yes. She breathes deep, letting the morning light wash over her face, letting herself feel the weight of survival and claim. She says I am here. She says my name. He nods, silent, letting her words stand as truth. The house, the yard, even the blackened remnants of the mill beyond, seem to pause and listen. She looks over the fields, eyes steady, voice soft but firm. She says names are powerful. She says mine stayed. He says yes. She says I will not vanish again. He says you won't. She says the world can try to bury us, but I am here. She repeats her name aloud, full and final. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows over the porch, the yard, the house that has held her. She breathes, steady, unbroken, chest rising and falling. He stands beside her, quiet, letting her claim it. She says this is mine. The house listens. The air listens. Even the earth beneath their feet listens. She says my name one last time. The land, the house, and the wind carry it, and for the first time in years, nothing tries to bury her again.